Hello guys and welcome to this video, or you can see it says summer series, but it's actually not summer. Actually, it's pretty typical autumn weather already. We had like rain all day today and maybe 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. So we're not going to call this a summer series anymore, and we'll go with a more flexible name in off-season series. So we can use it at each time of the year. So like you see here, it's not a big surprise. We start the series this year with another revisit of the prospect draft, as it's already a tradition, like third year running. And each year we do a revisit of the draft 6 years later. So this time around we focus on the 2014 draft, which is like if you don't recall easily, it's the Aaron Ekblad draft. Here you see the full list, and I won't be going into much detail on each pick or each round or everything. It will be more or less some focusing on different overall stats and lists and so on. And you can check out the full list. It will be linked in the description, and you can then slice and dice the whole draft list, and you see how you did, or how anyone else did, or how we failed. And with that said, we'll go into some overall draft class analysis. But before that, here's a quick trivia that you can name an answer before we finish this slide. So who you think had the best goals per games played out of the entire draft class, or at least up to this point? So pick your answer and I will tell you what the correct is in a few minutes. So starting by looking at round by round, here we have the 5 rounds. This was a typical 5-round draft that we had like for most of the year so far. And the blue line is the games played per player of that round, and the dotted line is the points per game played. So basically, blue line is quantity, orange dotted line is quality of the players. So we had a very strong second round in terms of quality, and you will see in a bit that it's mainly because of Pasternak and Braden Point. And we had a pretty disastrous fourth round, and the fifth round was much better, especially in terms of points per game. And in the fourth round, less than half of the players, of the total players, played more than a handful games in the NHL. So many of the prospects didn't pan out there, and there were some older prospects that we rolled the dice on in this round, like Jussi Rinas and Petri Kontiola, who was 30 at the time of the draft, one of the oldest players drafted ever. And in the fifth round we did a lot better, and you will see why, because some very, very good players were picked in the fifth round. So in the pie chart of where are they now, you see that pretty standard, around 55% of the players are in the NHL. Like 20% are still in the minors, and the other quarter have gone to Europe in the major European leagues like the KHL, SHL, and the Swiss and the Finnish Liga, and the other leagues. And what I found funny is that among other leagues, 2 of the 6 players there play for the same Austrian team, the Villeha Sportverein, which is this is their logo, which is a nice logo. So it's it's a strange coincidence. And in the age distribution, you see here pretty again close to standard distribution. No 26 years old were picked, but again not far from the average. Here the gray is the average from all drafts that we have done so far. And to the answer of our question, I would be surprised if someone has guessed it, but the best goals per game average in 2 total games and 2 goals, it's Patrick Sielov, who was a draft pick of Macon, and actually here is seen donning the San Diego Gulls jersey. So maybe Jay can trade for him and hope for a goal per game. Hint, not. So onto, as James suggested on the chat, onto some lists. And yes, we will have the typical best and worst picks list, and we start with the best players from the draft. This is from the total draft, not considering their drafting positions, just based on their stats, or at least some evaluation of their overall contribution. And these are the top 10 players. As you see, the top 3 are like head and shoulders above the rest. These are really the cream of the crop in terms of the 2014 draft class. Draisaitl and Pasternak were pretty close, and Braden Point is a definite third. After that, places between 4 and 8, the players are pretty close in terms of value, I think. What's popping out is like Mike Hoffman was picked in the 5th round, but we'll touch a bit more on that in detail in the next slide. And then here, like, D'Angelo and Binnington turned out to be pretty good in the last year, so basically they're rising very much in this list over the past two seasons, because they both have very strong seasons. And on the flip side, Shane Gostisbehere would have been here maybe like 5th or 6th a couple of seasons ago, but his stock has dropped, so he found himself just missing the cut. And Aaron Ekblad, the top selection, he still is a decent player, just not maybe what you would expect of your first overall selection. He's decent contributor also across the grid categories, so he still makes it in the top 10 of the overall players. And the next list are the players who are the best value picks. So best value picks, we qualify any player who was drafted in the 3rd round or later. So these are only later round picks. And here, not naturally, Hoffman takes the top spot, but I've put Arvidsson and Murray here ahead of Binnington because they were both picked later. And here in this list, I consider the draft position relevant, not only the stats. And we see here how many good players were picked in the 5th round, and Binnington and Brown were basically the only fantasy relevant players out of the 4th round, as we saw that it was pretty disastrous in terms of finding quality, and some solid picks in the 3rd round. Also, you see 3 picks for Linköping here, so Brad did very well, although you see the green, the guys with the green names are the ones who are still with the respective organization that drafted them. So Arvidsson is still a member of the Linköping Hockey Club, and Murray is still a Steeler. And on the previous slide, you can use the same color coding, but I wanted to actually talk about Hoffman here for a bit, because the first thing I noticed when I started doing this and I saw Hoffman in the 5th round, and I initially thought this must be some other Mike Hoffman, because I tend to remember there was another Mike Hoffman, but it's actually the same. And I looked into his career because I didn't remember why he was drafted so late. And he was a late bloomer of sorts, so he took a couple of years to develop in the AHL. And before the draft in 2014, he had a monster year in the AHL. So I was still surprised he was available as late as Mark. I managed to get him in the 5th round. But he was 25 at the point of the draft. So many players who have had very good AHL seasons don't pan out. For example, very similar age and season and quite good AHL contribution had Colton Sevier, but you know that Colton Sevier never developed more than a 4th line plugger in the NHL level. So it was a gamble that paid off big time for the Ice Dice. And what was, I think, very impressive about these picks is I would consider it one of the best picks ever made in our prospects drafts is that Mike Hoffman started contributing right away for the Ice Dice. Like he has had since that draft 6 seasons of basically guaranteed 25 goals, 30 assists, 30 penalty minutes, and 3 shots per game. So he didn't have any development time. He jumped into the lineup right away and was a regular contributor. As you see, he's not in green. His name is not in green because he was traded last year around the beginning of the season, and he's actually a member of the Blazers now. But the Ice Dice got in return for him Seth Jones, so for 1 year. So it was quite a pickup with a 5th round pick. As I said, the other players here also useful NHLers picked later on in the draft. And on to the next list, what Clint feared he would dominate. And he is actually not far from the truth because these are the top 10 busts. Of course, busts is used a bit speculatively here because not all of these players are busts in terms of NHL contribution, but in terms of what you expect from their draft position. And here you see, yes, Michael Dal Cole, probably one of the biggest disappointments, not only of this draft. Of course, not compared. You cannot compare it to Yakupov because he's still likely the biggest bust, being a top overall selection. Sam Bennett here gets off the hook for the top spots because of the fact that he has managed to still be a serviceable fantasy contributor and he has decent penalty minutes and hits totals, but his scoring is nowhere near where it was expected to be from a top for a top 3 selection. And the other guys are basically guys who were expected to be offensive stars in the NHL, but have not panned out, like Hosank and Milano and Honka. And here about the 10th spot, I could have gone with 3 picks that the Flames had in very close succession. So they had the picks, 31, 33, and 34, and they selected Jori Lehtera, Irji Sekac, and Kirsten Gurlevskis, a Latvian goaltender, and none of these picks panned out. But I'm mentioning here Jori Lehtera because he was 27 at the time of the draft, and it was one of those examples where picking older player early is not the best idea. And also picking 27 years old is no longer eligible under our current rules, but it was back then. So that's why we had like 30 years old prospects. But overall, you see here the picks, and there was a success, a series of 9 picks between positions 14 and 22 overall. So 9 selections, from which only one relevant NHL player came out. So we had some really bad stretch in the end of the first and the beginning of the second. So that's why this drags the numbers of the first round as a whole down. So it makes the whole first round look less good, worse. So okay, so how did the teams draft? So I've used again, like last year, the same roto-based system. Trust me, it's absolutely flawless. It rates them perfectly. And the first thing you can see here is right below that the Ramparts actually sat out the whole draft. So they traded away all their picks. So naturally they're just last here. And on the other side, as we saw already with the lists, the Blazers had 3 players selected in the top 10, and Linköping had 3 players in the best value selection. So naturally these two teams had the best drafts overall. And also the next 4 teams had very good drafts. And then most of the teams who had a decent to not so good draft. On the right hand side, you can see the players who are still with their drafting teams. So the Aces have 4, so which is the most. So out of their 5 picks, they still hold 4 of them. And the color coded here, the names. The green ones are still farm players, so basically they're one of those institutionalized farm players. So basically slow developers, or just ones who are kept on the farm because there are free spots. Like for example, I think the Atlanta have always had spots, so they kept Gudlevsky. So although he's not NHL affiliated for years, I think now. But anyway, and the blue ones are still with their, not still, maybe it still is not, are again with their drafting team, because they have been traded away and then reacquired in another trade. So you see here that Duclair has been traded and reacquired, and Rowan McEwen also, and Kamenev has been traded 4 times. So he went around and came back to the Ghost, which is not unheard of, as we know the Markstrom case. And a random fact, speaking of Kamenev and being traded 4 times, Brendan Lemieux has been the most traded player of the draft class so far. He has been traded 5 times. But I feel this fact is actually not really random. So for the truly random fact of the day, I'll give you this. So I'll let it sink in for a moment. So now that you're blessed with this knowledge, you know what I mean when I post on the chat something like this. So okay. So back to our main story. You see, yeah, you can dissect this graph. This is graph, is table, is chart, is table. Okay, so this table, and you see different tendencies or facts, or I don't know. You can look at it in detail and comments on the chat or whatever you would like. So the next thing is, because this is already the 3rd year we do this, so I thought it's good to start looking into perspective. So basically put together the 3 revisits that we had and has some overall grades, like team by team ranking so far based on the same flawless Roto system to evaluate each team's draft performance. We have the all the teams ranked so far, and the Grizzly Adams and the Linköping teams lead the way so far, and both of them have not had a bad draft, because basically every other team has had at least a below average draft. As you see, all of the other teams that have performed pretty well in the top 7, so from the Ice Dice down to the Steelers, have had at least one below average draft, and some like the Turtles and the Vipers have not had even an above average. But what's interesting is that, also, or we will be reminded in the next video of what happened in the actual season. But what happens in the actual seasons, and then, even more so in the actual playoffs, isn't so directly related to the draft performance. So you see the Ramparts here are pretty low, but we all know that they were one of the most successful teams, have been one of the most successful teams so far, maybe the most successful in terms of playoff success and also regular season standings. So they must have done something else right, like trading or auctioning, and the Grizzly Adams and the Ice Dice haven't won any championships yet. So it is not the end-all be-all of successful fantasy hockey team management, but it is definitely important. And what is interesting here is the top 4 teams at this stage, and according to this ranking, are all of the Norris. So this is maybe one of the foundations of the might of the Norris that we came to see over the next couple of seasons before they went into, or some of the teams went into a rebuild over the past 3 years. But in this time frame, exactly like 2014 to 2017, 2018, I think the Norris was definitely the strongest of the divisions. And one other stat, which is overall the quality of the overall selections. So basically, in disregarding draft and draft rounds and positions, just overall. And game played per pick, so per player selected, average number of games played, points, and penalty in minutes. And what is interesting is the 2014 draft is definitely had a lot more busts. So this is reflected in the whole number of games played pick, but also that the ones who, so basically it was a more or less a high risk, high reward draft, which is also underlined by the fact that many more forwards, or relatively more forwards, were selected, and forwards are typically the more high risk, high reward picks. And this was both reflected in the number of games played, which is lower because many players didn't play at all or very few games, but also the ones who made it were actually pretty good at scoring. And naturally, when you're pretty good at scoring, you're not very physical, so that's why the penalty minutes are lower. So basically, I think it makes sense based on everything we saw so far. And I think that pretty much wraps it up. Feel free to chat it up and let me know. I will be intrigued to hear, for example, Mark's thoughts on picking up Mike Hoffman in the 5th round, or if he remembers being it a good pick. Or of course, Brad always has interesting thoughts. Max, and anyone, just chat it up, because we are in these very slow hockey days, and also things happening around us aren't very positive, if you disregard COVID positive. So anyway, thanks for watching, and see you See you around.